The slave ship cut through the darkness of space like a knife through flesh, and inside its cold metal belly, Commander Elias Vance opened his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. He could not move his arms or his legs because thick chains held him against the wall, and the air around him smelled like rust and fear and something else he could not name. "Where am I?" he thought. But no answer came. The last thing he remembered was standing on the bridge of his patrol vessel near the edge of the solar system, watching something massive appear out of nowhere. Something that made his ship look like a toy. Something that swallowed his crew whole before anyone could even scream. Now he was here, wherever here was, surrounded by creatures he had never seen before. They were tall and thin with skin the color of whetstone, and their eyes were completely black. And when they looked at him, they smiled with mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. "The primitive is awake," one of them said. And Elias understood the words, even though the creature was not speaking English. And he realized they must have put something in his head. Some kind of translator. "Look at it," another one laughed, poking Elias with a metal rod that sent pain shooting through his entire body. So small and so weak and so wonderfully pathetic, Elias did not scream, and he did not beg. And he did not give them the satisfaction of seeing his fear. He simply watched them with eyes that had seen 3 wars. Eyes that had buried 2 daughters. Eyes that belonged to a man who had nothing left to lose. The journey lasted 17 days, according to the marks. Elias scratched into the wall with his fingernail. And during that time he learned many things. He learned that his captors called themselves the Vitani, and they had ruled something called the Orion Spur for 12,000 years. And they considered every other species in the galaxy to be nothing more than animals to be bought and sold. Learned that Earth had been discovered by accident, a small blue world on the edge of nowhere, and the Vethani had laughed when they scanned it. Laughed at the primitive technology and the short lifespans and the fragile bodies of the creatures living there. He learned that he was the only human they had taken. A sample, a curiosity, something to show off at the markets, and he learned to hate with a fire that burned so hot it kept him warm, even in the freezing darkness of his cell on the 18th day. The ship landed on a world called Vithan Prime, and guards dragged Elias through streets made of polished black stone while thousands of aliens watched and pointed and laughed. The buildings rose so high they seemed to touch the purple sky, and everywhere Elias looked, he saw wealth beyond imagination, wealth built on the backs of slaves, wealth that dripped with the suffering of 1,000,000 conquered worlds. They brought him to a massive arena called the Grand Auction House, and the noise inside was so loud it made his ears ring. And he saw hundreds of creatures on platforms being sold to the highest bidder. Some of them looked almost human, and some of them looked like nightmares given flesh. And all of them wore chains just like his, Lot 742. A voice boomed through the arena as guards pushed Elias onto a platform. A specimen from a newly discovered world called Earth. Species designation human. Average lifespan approximately 80 standard years. Laughter erupted from the crowd, and Elias felt his face burn with shame and rage. 80 years, someone shouted. My breakfast lived longer than that. Look at its muscles, another voice called out. I have seen stronger infants, the auctioneer. A massive creature with 6 arms and a face like a melted candle gestured at Elias like he was showing off a broken piece of furniture. Yes, yes. I know it is not impressive, the auctioneer said, with amusement dripping from every word. But think of it as a novelty, a conversation piece. Something to show your guests when they visit your estates. Elias stood perfectly still as the crowd continued to mock him. But his eyes were moving constantly, studying every face, every species. Every detail he could absorb. He watched how the Vethani interacted with each other, noticing the subtle signs of rivalry and distrust between different factions. He watched the other slave species. memorizing which ones looked broken and which ones still had fire in their eyes. He watched the guards, counting their numbers and noting their weapons and observing how they moved, and he listened to every conversation within earshot, picking up fragments of information about politics and technology and the structure of this empire that thought itself untouchable. 50 credits. Someone finally called out, and more laughter followed because 50 credits was apparently nothing, an insult. The price of garbage. 50 credits to the Corvati Archon, the auctioneer said, with barely hidden contempt. Anyone else want this primitive creature? No. Very well then. Sold. The Corvati Archon was a being that looked like a spider had mated with a crystal. All sharp angles and glittering surfaces and too many legs. And when his servants came to collect Elias, they handled him like he was already dead. You will join my menagerie, the Archon said in a voice that sounded like ice cracking. I collect curiosities from across the galaxy, and you, little human, are the most pathetic curiosity I have ever purchased. Elias said nothing, and his silence seemed to amuse the Archon. It does not even speak, the Archon laughed. Perhaps it is too stupid to understand what is happening to it. But Elias understood everything. He understood that these beings saw him as nothing, as less than nothing, as a joke to be laughed at and forgotten. He understood that his species was about to be enslaved or destroyed, that Earth was in danger, that everyone he had ever known was in danger, and he understood something else, something that filled him with a cold and patient certainty. He was going to destroy them all, not today, and not tomorrow, and maybe not even for years to come, but someday. Somehow, he would make every single creature who had laughed at him tonight pay for their arrogance, would learn their secrets and exploit their weaknesses, and tear their precious empire down stone by stone. And when it was over, when the galaxy finally understood what humanity was capable of, no one would ever laugh at a human again. The guards dragged him away into the night, and Elias Vance began to plan. The Archon's menagerie was a prison disguised as a paradise, and Elias Vance spent his first month there learning its secrets. Enclosures were vast and filled with plants and water features, and everything a captive might need to survive. But the walls were invisible force fields that burned like fire if you touched them. And the sky above was just a projection hiding the metal ceiling of the Station 112 species lived in this collection, gathered from across the galaxy over centuries. And most of them had given up hope long ago. Elias watched them shuffle through their days with empty eyes, eating the food that dropped from dispensers, sleeping in the shelters provided for them, waiting for nothing because nothing was ever going to change. But Elias was different. And the other captives noticed almost immediately. You still have the fire, said a creature named Fesca on the 43rd day of his captivity. And she was from a species called the Rin. Blue-skinned and four-armed and beautiful in a way that was completely alien. I can see it burning behind your eyes, even when you try to hide it. Fire can be dangerous. Elias replied carefully, because he did not yet know who to trust. Fesca laughed. And it was the first genuine laugh he had heard since his capture. Fire is the only thing worth having in this place, she said. Everything else has been taken from us over the following weeks. Elias and Fesca became allies, and then they became friends. And she taught him things that no amount of observation could have revealed. She taught him that the Vethany Empire was not as unified as it appeared, that 12 great houses competed for power constantly, that wars between them had nearly torn the galaxy apart more than once. She taught him about the other empires that existed beyond Vethany space, the Corvati Dominion and the Sith Collective and the Merchants of Kal, all of them corrupt and cruel in their own unique ways. She taught him that the technology keeping them imprisoned was old, so old that the Vethany had forgotten how it worked, and they simply maintained it by following instructions left by their ancestors. They have not invented anything new in 3,000 years. Theska explained one night as they sat together watching the fake stars. They are powerful because they were powerful before, not because they are clever or creative. Elias absorbed this information like a sponge absorbs water, and he began to see cracks in the foundation of this empire that seemed so unbreakable. The guards came twice a day to feed them and once a week to perform medical examinations. And during these visits, Elias watched everything with perfect attention. He memorized the codes they entered on the door panels. He studied the weapons they carried and figured out how they worked. He learned their patrol schedules and noted which guards were lazy and which ones were alert, and he discovered something that changed everything. Humans could learn faster than any other species in the menagerie, faster even than the Vethani themselves, where it took a Rin 6 months to master a new language. Elias learned 3 in his first year, where the other captives struggled to understand the basic technology around them. Elias was hacking door panels and redirecting surveillance feeds within 18 months, where the Vethani followed rules and traditions without question. Elias questioned everything and found better ways to do almost everything. "How do you do it?" asked Morthuk, a massive reptilian creature from a world called Skarn. "How do you learn so quickly when your species is so young?" Elias thought about this question for a long time before answering. "On my world, we had to adapt or die." He finally said, "Our planet tried to kill us every single day, with cold and heat and disease and predators and natural disasters. And we survived all of it because we refused to stay the same." He paused and looked around at the faces watching him. Faces from 100 different worlds. Faces that had forgotten what hope looked like. Your species evolved for millions of years in stable environments. He continued, "You became perfect for your specific conditions, but you lost the ability to change quickly when conditions changed. And humans never became perfect for anything." Theska said slowly as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Exactly," Elias nodded. "We are not the strongest or the fastest or the longest lived, but we can become whatever we need to become whenever we need to become it." Word spread through the menagerie in whispers, and soon other captives began coming to Elias with questions and requests. And desperate hope, he taught a group of small furry creatures called the Keeli how to pick locks using nothing but their claws and patience. Showed the massive Skarn how to disable the shock collars that kept them docile and afraid. He worked with the telepathic Voss to establish a communication network that the guards could never detect, and slowly, carefully, invisibly, he built an army, not an army of soldiers with weapons and training, because that would have been noticed and crushed immediately. Instead, he built an army of believers, an army of dreamers, an army of broken spirits that he slowly put back together one piece at a time. "Why do you help us?" Theska asked him one night after they had spent hours planning in secret. "You could escape alone. You have the skills. Why do you stay?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was heavy with memory. "I had 2 daughters once," he said, "Elena and Sophia, and they both died in a war that should never have happened. A war started by powerful men who saw regular people as nothing more than numbers on a chart." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I promised myself at their graves that I would never let the powerful abuse the weak again. And I broke that promise when I joined the military and followed orders instead of questioning them." He looked up at the fake stars and thought of Earth. Thought of all the people who had no idea what was coming for them. "I will not break that promise again," he said. "Everyone in this place deserves freedom. Every species in this empire deserves freedom. And I am going to make sure they get it, even if it takes the rest of my life." Theska reached out and touched his hand with one of her 4 arms. "Then we will do it together," she said. "All of us, every species you have taught and inspired, we will follow you into whatever comes next." Elias smiled. And it was the first real smile he had worn since the day he was captured. Not follow. He corrected her gently. We will walk together, side by side, because that is what freedom actually means. 3 years passed in the menagerie. 3 years of learning and teaching and planning in secret. And when the night finally came to act, Elias Vance was ready. The Archon's Ascension celebration was the biggest event of the year. And every guard would be drunk on ceremonial nectar by midnight. It was time to show the galaxy what a single human could do when properly motivated. The night of the Archon's Ascension celebration arrived with music and lights, and the sound of 1,000 drunk voices echoing through the station. Elias crouched in the shadows of his enclosure and watched the guards stumble past on their patrol, their weapons hanging loose at their sides, their eyes glazed with the effects of ceremonial nectar. Now, he whispered into the darkness, and the words spread through the network like fire through dry grass in Enclosure 7. The Keeley began picking the locks on their restraint collars in Enclosure 12. The massive Skarn named Morthic disabled the shock systems using the techniques Elias had taught them in Enclosure 23. The telepathic Voss sent out a silent signal that reached every corner of the menagerie. It was happening. It was finally happening, and Elias felt his heart pound. In his chest like a war drum, he moved to the control panel hidden behind a decorative rock and entered the codes he had memorized over 3 years of careful observation. The force field around his enclosure flickered once, twice, and then died completely. Elias stepped out into freedom for the first time in over 1,000 days, and the air tasted sweeter than anything he had ever known. Phase 1 complete, Theska said, as she emerged from her own enclosure with 11 other Rin warriors behind her. All force fields are down. Casualties? None so far. Elias nodded and pulled the sharpened bone from where he had hidden it inside his clothing. A weapon he had crafted from the remains of a meal months ago. A weapon no scanner had ever detected because it was just garbage to their eyes. Then we moved to Phase 2. They flowed through the corridors like ghosts. 47 different species moving together in perfect coordination. And every guard they encountered was either too drunk to fight or too surprised to react before being knocked. Unconscious Elias had forbidden killing, except when absolutely necessary, because dead guards would trigger alarms and they needed time, but there was one death that had to happen tonight. One target that could not be spared. The Archon's personal chambers were at the top of the station, protected by the most advanced security systems in the Korvathi Dominion. But Elias had been studying those systems for 3 years, and he knew every weakness. The secondary ventilation shaft, he said to Theska as they reached the final barrier. It connects to the waste processing system, and the Archon never bothered to install sensors there because he could not imagine anyone crawling through filth to reach him. That is disgusting, Theska said with a grimace. That is why it will work. 20 minutes later, Elias pulled himself out of the shaft and into the Archon's private quarters. Covered in substances, he tried very hard not to think about the Archon was alone, lounging on a platform of cushions and silk, surrounded by screens showing the celebration happening throughout his domain. What is this? The crystalline spider creature hissed as he noticed a filthy human standing in his room. How did you get in here? Guards. Your guards cannot hear you, Elias said calmly as he walked forward with the bone weapon in his hand. They are all unconscious or dead, and your security systems have been disabled. The Archon scrambled backward, and for the first time, Elias saw fear in those multifaceted eyes. You are the human, the Archon said with growing horror. The pathetic creature I bought at auction. The one that could not even speak. I can always speak, Elias replied. I simply had nothing to say to you until now. What do you want? I can give you anything, wealth, power, your own planet. Name your price. Elias stopped directly in front of the creature that had kept him caged for 3 years. The creature that had laughed at his species. The creature that had called him a curiosity. "I want you to understand something before you die," Elias said. "I want you to know that you did this to yourself, you and every other slaver in this galaxy. You created me when you put me in chains. Please," the Archon begged. "Please, I will free all of them, every slave in my collection. Just let me live." You should have thought about that before you bought living beings like they were furniture. The bone weapon moved faster than the Archon could react. And the most powerful being in the Korvathi Dominion fell with a sound like shattering glaciales, stood over the body, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just cold determination for what came next. Walked to the Archon's communication console and began typing commands he had memorized years ago. Accessing systems he should never have been able to touch. Sending signals to places no slave should have known existed. "What are you doing?" Theska asked as she entered the room through the door Elias had unlocked from inside. "I am sending everything," Elias said without looking up. "Every technological secret I have learned. Every weapon schematic, every political weakness, every piece of information that could help my people survive what is coming." "Coming?" "The Vethany will respond to this," Elias explained as his fingers flew across the controls. "An alien killed one of the 12 most powerful beings in their space. They will send a fleet to Earth. They will try to exterminate my entire species as punishment." His jaw tightened with resolve. "But now my people will have time to prepare. 3 years of travel time before the fleet arrives. 3 years to study everything I am sending them. 3 years to get ready for war." The transmission completed with a soft chime. And Elias finally turned to face his friend. "We need to leave this station immediately," he said. "There are ships in the lower docking bay. Enough to carry everyone to safety. And where will we go?" Elias smiled, and there was something dangerous in that smile. "There are others like us, scattered across the galaxy. Escaped slaves and resistance fighters, and people who hate these empires as much as we do. We will find them, and we will unite them." He took one last look at the Archon's body on the floor. "The Vethani think they are going to Earth to crush a primitive species that got lucky once," he said. "They have no idea what they are walking into." 4 hours later, 17 stolen ships launched from the station and scattered across the galaxy, carrying representatives from 47 liberated species. News of the Archon's death spread like wildfire. And the name Elias Vance became both a curse and a prayer depending on who was speaking it, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, a transmission raced toward a small blue planet that had no idea its entire future had just changed forever. Earth received the transmission on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening the entire world had changed. Governments that had been at war with each other for decades suddenly found common ground in the face of extinction. And scientists who had spent their careers competing for funding now worked side by side in massive underground facilities. The information Elias Vance had sent was worth more than gold, more than oil, more than every precious resource humanity had ever fought over. Combined weapon designs that defied known physics, shield technology that could stop nuclear warheads, engine systems that bent space itself around a ship like fabric folding on itself, and most importantly, weaknesses. Elias had documented every flaw in Vethany technology, every gap in their tactics, every blind spot in their sensors. And humanity studied these weaknesses like scripture. 3 years is not a long time to prepare for an alien invasion. But humans had something no other species in the galaxy possessed: the ability to work together when survival demanded. In factories that had built cars, now built warships. Universities that had taught literature now taught alien languages. Children who had dreamed of being doctors now dreamed of being soldiers. And when the Vethani cleansing fleet finally arrived at the edge of the solar system, 2,000 warships strong. They found something very different from the primitive world they expected, Admiral. We are detecting organized defensive formations around the third planet. A Vethany sensor officer reported with confusion in his voice. They appear to have ships, thousands of ships. Admiral Kethron laughed from his command throne. A sound like bones grinding together. Impossible, he declared. They had no space capability when we surveyed them. This must be some kind of trick. Should we proceed with caution? Caution is for species that have something to fear, the Admiral sneered. We are the Vethany hegemony. We have conquered 10,000 worlds. These insects cannot possibly threaten us. The fleet advanced in standard formation. The same formation they had used for 8,000 years. The same tactics that had never once failed them. They did not notice the mines hidden in the asteroid belt until the first explosions ripped through their forward elements. They did not detect the human stealth ships until torpedoes were already slamming into their shields. They did not realize they were flying into a trap until the trap had already closed around them. Admiral Kethron watched his fleet die around him and could not understand what was happening. Could not process how primitive creatures were destroying ships that had conquered galaxies. How? He whispered as a human missile punched through his bridge and everything went white. How was this possible? The Battle of Sol lasted 11 hours, and when it was over, the greatest military force the Vethany had ever assembled was nothing but scattered debris. Orbiting Jupiter, humanity did not celebrate. Not yet, because Elias had warned them in his transmission that winning one battle would not be enough. The empires would send more fleets. Bigger fleets, endless fleets, until Earth was burned to ash unless humanity took the fight to them first. And so began the liberation campaigns. Elias Vance had not been idle during those 3 years, traveling across the galaxy in stolen ships, building alliances with escaped slaves and oppressed species and anyone else willing to fight against the old order when Earth's newly built armada launched from the solar system. They did not fly alone. Rin warriors fought beside human marines, their 4 arms wielding weapons they had designed together. Skarn heavy infantry smashed through enemy lines while human air support reigned. Fire from above Ikili infiltrators opened doors that would have taken human soldiers hours to breach. And Voss telepaths provided communication that no enemy could intercept. World by world, system by system, the Alliance pushed into Vethany space. They did not conquer. They liberated. Every planet they freed added more soldiers to their ranks, more ships to their fleets, more anger to fuel the fire that Elias had started in that menagerie. So, the Vethany called them barbaric savages who did not understand the natural order of things. The Korvathi called them relentless monsters who refused to accept their proper place in the hierarchy. The merchants of Kal tried to buy them off with offers of wealth and territory. And when that failed, they tried to assassinate the human leaders. And when that failed, they simply ran. But there was another species watching from the shadows. Ancient beings called the Sithari, who had existed since before the first Vethany drew breath. The Sithari had seen empires rise and fall for 1,000,000 years, had watched countless species burn bright and fade into nothing, had believed they understood everything there was to understand about the galaxy. They sent an ambassador to meet with Elias Vance on the bridge of his flagship, a crystalline entity that shifted and flowed like living water. "We have been observing you," the ambassador said in a voice like wind through chimes. "You and your strange alliance of broken things. And what have you concluded?" Elias asked, older now, gray hair turned white, but eyes still burning with the same fire that had carried him through the menagerie. "We have concluded that you are different from anything we have seen before." "Different how?" The ambassador paused, and something like wonder flickered across its liquid features. "Every species we have ever encountered eventually reaches a limit. a point where they stop growing and changing and simply maintain what they have built. But you humans do not seem to have such a limit. Elias smiled at this. We have a saying on my world, he replied. What does not kill us makes us stronger. That is not biologically accurate. It is not supposed to be accurate. Elias laughed. It is supposed to be true. And for humans, those are very different things. The ambassador was silent for a long moment. We Sithari have many words for the species we have observed over our long existence, it finally said. But we have never had a word for beings like you, so we have created one. What word? Inevitable. The ambassador flowed backward toward the door. The old empires are already dead, it said. They simply have not realized it yet, and when the dust settles and you stand victorious, remember that the Sithari wish to be your friends rather than your enemies. Elias watched the ancient being leave and turn back to the star map on his screen. The map that showed world after world falling to the Alliance. The map that showed an entire galaxy changing before his eyes. Inevitable, he repeated to himself. And he thought of Elena and Sophia and every promise he had made over their graves. He was keeping those promises now, one freed world at a time. 40 years after Elias Vance stood in chains on an auction block. He stood in the grand chamber of the Galactic Concord and looked out at a galaxy transformed. The chamber itself was built on the ruins of the Vathani capital, constructed from the melted remains of slave chains. And every seat was filled with representatives from species that had once been property. 400 different worlds had sent delegates to this place. 400 different voices that had once been silenced. 400 different dreams that had finally come true. Elias leaned heavily on the podium because his body was failing him now. 87 years old and held together by medicine and willpower. But his mind was as sharp as ever. Theska sat in the front row. Her blue skin faded to pale silver with age. And she watched him with tears streaming down her face. Murthik the Skarn stood guard at the door. Massive and scarred from 100 battles. The same guard who had once asked Elias how humans learned so quickly. The Keeley delegation chittered quietly among themselves. Their children and grandchildren sitting beside them. Children who had never known what it meant to wear a collar, and in the very back of the room, almost hidden in shadow, the Sithari ambassador watched with those strange liquid eyes that had seen a million years of history. Friends, Elias began, and his voice was rough and weak, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. We have come a long way together. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. 40 years ago, I was bought at auction for 50 credits, he continued. The auctioneer laughed and called me pathetic, and everyone agreed that my species was too primitive to matter. He paused and let the memory wash over him. The shame and rage and desperate hope that had burned in his chest that night. They measured us by our lifespan and found us wanting, he said. They measured us by our technology and found us primitive. They measured us by our physical strength and found us laughable. His hands gripped the podium tighter, but they never measured what actually mattered. The chamber was completely silent now. Every being leaning forward to hear the words of the man who had changed everything. They never measured our stubbornness, our refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. His eyes swept across the assembled delegates. They never measured our capacity for hope, our ability to dream of better things, even in the darkest cells. He straightened his spine despite the pain it caused. They never measured our fury, the white-hot anger that burns inside every human who sees injustice and refuses to look away. Theska was openly sobbing now, and she was not the only one. The Vethani had 12,000 years of dominion, Elias said, and his voice grew stronger as he spoke. 12,000 years to build something beautiful, something lasting, something worthy of all that time and power. He shook his head slowly. And what did they build? Chains, auction blocks. empires of suffering that stretched across the stars. His fist slammed down on the podium. We had 40 years. 40 years of preparation and 20 years of war. 60 years against their 12,000. He pointed at the crowd before him. And in those 60 years, we built something they never imagined was possible. We built freedom. We built this Concord. We built a galaxy where no one has to kneel again. The chamber erupted in cheers and roars and sounds that no human throat could make. A symphony of joy from 400 different species. Elias waited for the noise to fade before continuing. "I am an old man now," he said more quietly. "And I will not live to see everything we have planted grow to full bloom. But that is all right, because I know what kind of seeds we have scattered." He looked directly at the Sithari ambassador in the back. "The Ancient Ones called us inevitable. And I have thought about that word many times over the years." He smiled. And it was the same smile he had worn in the menagerie all those decades ago. "We are not inevitable because we are strong or clever or special. We are inevitable because we refuse to stop. We refuse to give up. We refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must always be." His eyes moved to Theska. "I did not do this alone. I could never have done this alone. Every species in this room played their part. Every individual who chose hope over despair helped make this happen." He bowed his head for a moment. "I have been asked to give this new Concord some words to remember. Some message to carry forward into the future we have built together." When he looked up again, his eyes were bright with tears he refused to shed. "So here is my message. Carved in the stone of this chamber, translated into every language of every member world. A reminder for all the generations yet to come." He took a deep breath. "You measured us by our lifespan and found us wanting." His voice rang out, clear and strong. "You measured us by our technology and found us primitive." The crowd began to murmur the words along with him because they had heard this speech before and waited years to hear him deliver it in this place. "But you never measured what mattered. Our refusal to stay broken." 400 species spoke as one voice now. "You had 12,000 years of dominion. You spent it building chains. The walls themselves seemed to shake. We had 40 years of fury. We spent it building something you never imagined." Elias raised his fist into the air. "A galaxy where no one kneels again." The roar that followed was so loud it could be heard in orbit. A sound of triumph and gratitude and fierce hope for the future. Elias stood at the podium and let the noise wash over him. And he thought of Elena and Sophia and everyone he had lost along the way. And he knew that they would have been proud 3 days later. Commander Elias Vance died in his sleep, surrounded by family, not just his human family, but his Rin family and his Skarn family, and his Keeley family and representatives from every species he had. Help to free Theska held his hand as he took his last breath. And the Sithari ambassador stood vigil outside his door for reasons it never explained. The galaxy mourned for a standard month. And monuments were built on 10,000 worlds. And songs were written in languages that had not existed when Elias was born. But the greatest monument was the galaxy itself. Changed forever by one human who refused to break, and for 1,000 generations afterward. Whenever someone asked how the great empires fell, the answer was always the same. They underestimated a human once. The galaxy never recovered.